All right, welcome back to the Age of Limits. We were just talking about the three things that were causing a major recession in the United States in the 1970s: inflation, increased international competition, and we were about to look at shortages. And the thing that we're talking about that's pretty obvious right there on the screen, the shortage of the thing we're talking about is, of course, gasoline. In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries basically woke up one morning and just realized how much leverage they had over the American economy. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as OPEC, had been around for a while and acting as an informal bargaining power for the third world countries to work together to negotiate the sale of oil to industrialized nations. But it didn't have a lot of real global power. It was like a sales rep. It just negotiated the price. But in 1973, OPEC began to catch on to how much leverage it really had in its relationships to countries like the United States. Oil-producing countries, predominantly Middle Eastern, might not have had much industry of their own, but they had something that industrial nations really, really needed, and of course, that is oil. In 1973, when a coalition of Middle Eastern countries led by Egypt and Syria were at war with Israel, known as the Yom Kippur War, that was trying to retake the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights that they had lost in the 6 Days War in 1967, a Middle Eastern splinter group of OPEC called the Organization of Arab Petroleum Countries, OAPEC, you can see it on the screen, announced that it would not sell petroleum to any country that supported Israel. Well, guess what country was one of the largest supporters of Israel? The United States. About the same time that AOPEC decided not to sell to the United States, OPEC itself included, but not exclusively Middle Eastern countries, announced that it was raising its international prices for the export of oil by 5 times, from $3 a barrel to $15 a barrel. Those twin shocks, right? The lack of gas, one group saying we're not selling to you, the other group saying we're raising the price, that is going to send a huge shockwave to gas prices. The fuel shortage, this is the first major fuel shortage in the United States since World War II. It caused a skyrocketing prices of oil. U.S. had to worry about the price of availability of oil, of energy, of gasoline prices. All of this is either skyrocketing or out completely. And exposed a gigantic vulnerability in the U.S. economy, that our economy is very much subject to, or we're dependent on these other nations for oil. So all of this was a economic and financial perfect storm, and the United States was caught in the middle of it. In fact, the economy was stuck in an awkward position. It was such an awkward position that economists had to invent a new word to describe this problem. This new word is stagflation. Stagflation means the economy, or stagnation means the economy is not doing very well. Inflation means that the price of everything was going up. Everything was becoming more expensive. Usually, those two problems are mutually exclusive. Prices usually don't go up when the economy is doing very, very badly. But in this case, they did. Hence the term stagflation. The prices of everything were going up. In this case, the money from those higher prices were not going to American companies. They were going to countries that have oil and are charging more for it. A lot of those countries were going to Western Europe and Japan to pay for imported goods instead of stuff that was made in the United States. It's also going to pay off the government's lingering debt for things like Vietnam. The U.S. was losing money to other countries while the domestic economy was getting worse and worse. A stagnant economy and inflation. And this is a catch-22. Solving flat stagflation is a catch-22. The best way to revive a stagnant economy is with inflation, right? You want to raise the prices so that the people that are selling stuff get more money for the stuff they sell, right? So let me give you an example. GM, General Motors, can't afford to pay their employees. So they're going to raise the price of a car by $10,000. And so if you buy a new car, that gives General Motors $10,000 more than they used to have, and so they can spend that money on their employees, right? They have $10,000 more they can use to pay their employees. But the government doesn't want to do that in this case, raise inflation, because we already have inflation. That's already a problem. And the way to stop inflation is to limit economic growth. But the government doesn't want to do that because the economy is already stagnant. We're stuck. So the problem really started under Nixon. In 1973, prices rose at 10%. But 1974, prices rose to 12%. And by the time Ford came into office in August of 1974, after the oil problems were really beginning to sink in, he faced what economists would call a complete disaster. And he couldn't fix it. Ford drew up some ideas of how he could deal with the market. They're traditional Republican ideas that have worked over time. Things like lowering taxes, having less regulation. But because Ford was not as skilled a politician, he faced lots of roadblocks in Congress. Congress really doesn't take Ford seriously because he's not an elected president, right? He doesn't have the will of the people behind him. So the government is mostly deadlocked for most of the recession of 1974 and 1975. So not getting anything done through government, Ford turned his attention directly to the American people and tried to get America, us, the people, to fight inflation. He announced to the public that inflation was public enemy number one, and he called upon the American people to stop it through volunteerism rather than through government. He encouraged people to buy only the things they absolutely needed, to shop wisely, reduce their expenditures, and then put the money that they saved into a bank rather than spending it. He called it WHIP, Whip Inflation Now campaign, and he had these buttons that said "when" on them. He was trying to draw on a lot of the volunteerism that we saw quite successfully in World War II. People changed their buying habits to support the war effort, and he was hoping the same thing could happen here, but we're not at war, right? So inflation went down a little bit. The WIN campaign kind of worked, but unemployment started to hit. The unemployment started to hit its worst numbers since the Great Depression. Unemployment was at 9%. And all Ford had to combat these very, very serious problems like inflation and unemployment and we're all out of oil is a button that says whip inflation now. Ford looked kind of silly, right? The nation was in the middle of a very severe economic crisis, and his primary answer to that was to make a button. By the time Ford's months in office were up, he was getting attacked from both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats slammed him for not giving the effort or giving a solution to the problem. Republicans were angry that he kept labeling the Democrats, prevent him from getting things done. And so poor Ford was just kind of an unfortunate human being. As you can imagine, he does not run for re-election. So he is going to lose. His challenger is going to be Democrat Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was an outsider. He's not a Washington insider, and he uses that to his advantage. Watergate made many people mistrust the government or anyone who kind of seemed to be a government insider. And so Carter offered kind of a way of a folksy manner, kind of morality. He was a Christian. He was a Baptist. He was a Sunday school teacher. He taught Sunday school. He teaches Sunday school to this day. One of his main messages during his campaign was, "I will never lie to you." And so Carter won the 1976 election pretty comfortably. Not by a landslide, but fairly comfortably. 297 electoral votes to 240 electoral votes. Unfortunately, though, for poor President Carter, it was kind of all downhill from there. Carter's critics once said that he lurched from crisis to crisis. To give you an idea of how unpopular Carter was by the time he left, hang on. Sorry about that. When Nixon resigned from office, his approval rating was 24%. When Carter left office, his approval rating was 28%, only 4% higher than Nixon by 1979. So let's take a look at a couple of things that would have started that. The two main issues that Carter had to deal with was the energy crisis and the economy. And Carter couldn't get much more traction on either one of those issues than Ford or Nixon had. Nothing he tried really worked. It didn't fix either the economic problem or the energy problem. In fact, it even got a little bit worse. During Carter's administration, during his last 2 years of office, the price of retail goods went up 10% per year. And part of that was because Carter was flooding the economy with money, but more so because of OPEC. OPEC kept on raising the prices of oil. And then, near the end of his term, Carter is embroiled in a situation with Iran where 53 Americans wound up being taken hostage. Now, this had to do with some bad blood between the United States and Iran, which went back a long time. Let me take a second. Let's see. I guess I'll go take a second and explain that. I was going to say that the movie Argo explains this actually pretty well in the first few seconds of the movie. They run down this Iranian hostage crisis because that's what that movie is about. But in the 1950s, the United States helped overthrow Iran's democratic government and replaced it with a monarchy. In the 1950s, Iran was a constitutional monarchy, so the Iranian parliament and prime minister had a strong hand in controlling the Iranian government. And in the early 1950s, the prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the oil fields and refineries owned by British oil companies. Now, his argument was the oil belonged to Iran, and the British oil companies had acquired the rights through imperial power, and that the government was just trying to level the playing field. He was not a communist, but by nationalizing the oil prices, that made it look like something a communist would do. So from the United States point of view, and again in the 1950s, remember, we see the whole world through the Cold War glasses. Right, so anything that looks like communism is bad. So in 1953, American CIA joined with a group of conservative Iran military leaders to stage a coup that drove Mossadegh out of office, and they replaced him with the Shah, Raza Pahlavi. Iran then went from a constitutional monarchy before the coup to an absolute monarchy under Pahlavi. Sorry, I said that wrong, Pahlavi. Now, Pahlavi's administration had lots of human rights abuses, but Pahlavi and the United States maintained a very close relationship for about 25 years. One of the reasons why Iranians still do not trust the U.S. government today is this 1953 coup. The U.S. supports an unpopular and undemocratic government to protect its own interests. And because of that, Iran was always wary of U.S. interests. in the Middle East. And I'll talk more about that in the next video.